I thought I had finally found the perfect cabin. It wasn't just a house. It was like stepping into a time machine. Nestled at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by towering pines, the cabin looked untouched for decades. The kind of place most people drive past without a second glance. But to me, every crooked floorboard and faded shutter told a story. It called out to me, whispering that it was waiting for someone who cared. The first time I stepped inside, the smell hit me, aged wood, faint smoke, and the kind of mustiness that makes you feel like the walls remember everything. The floor creaked under my feet as if it were sighing in relief that someone had come to see it. Sunlight spilled through the crooked windows, illuminating patches of dust that danced like tiny fairies in the air. I couldn't help smiling. This place had character. It had soul. It had potential. I spent the first week just walking through every room, imagining what I could do. The kitchen was tiny, but the old cast-iron stove still worked. The living room had a stone fireplace that begged to be restored. The bedrooms were cramped but cozy, with original hardwood floors that, with a little polish, could shine again. The bathroom, well, the bathroom was a nightmare, but nothing a little elbow grease couldn't fix. I jotted down ideas in my notebook. Sanding the floors, repairing the roof, restoring the old windows, and keeping as much of the original charm as possible. The restoration started off slowly, but every day brought small victories. The floors started to shine. The peeling paint came off in chunks, revealing layers of colors from decades past. I discovered a hidden cupboard in the kitchen with faded jars inside, possibly homemade preserves from the 1950s. I laughed as I tried to clean them without breaking them, imagining the family who once lived there, bustling in this tiny kitchen, living their lives as the trees whispered outside. There were challenges, of course. One afternoon, I accidentally glued my shoe to the dining table. Another time, I dropped a paint can and it rolled across the floor like a bowling ball, leaving a trail of bright blue that was definitely not part of the plan. I learned quickly that restoration wasn't just about skill. It was about patience, creativity, and having a sense of humor. And I had plenty of humor. Sometimes I talked to the cabin as I worked, muttering, "Don't worry, buddy, we'll get you back to your former glory." Friends and neighbors started stopping by to see the progress. Some were genuinely impressed, others raised an eyebrow and said things like, "That place is ancient, are you sure it's safe?" I smiled and nodded, knowing that soon the cabin would prove itself. By the end of the first month, the cabin looked almost like a new home while keeping its old charm intact. The wood gleamed, the fireplace sparkled, and even the tiny kitchen had a warmth to it that made you want to stay forever. It felt like the perfect little escape, a dream I had been waiting for my entire life. I pictured quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings by the fire, and weekends of reading and reflection. It was peaceful, serene, and utterly mine. I felt like the luckiest person in the world. Every hammer strike, every brush of paint, every careful repair was worth it. The cabin had become a part of me. But then one evening, just as the sun dipped below the treetops and painted the sky in gold and pink, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA. Normally, emails from the HOA were boring, full of reminders about trash days or landscaping rules. But this one was different. I opened it slowly, thinking maybe it was a harmless notice. The words jumped out at me and my stomach dropped. The letter said I had 48 hours to demolish the cabin. 48 hours. To destroy everything I had built. My heart raced. I read it again. Maybe I had misread. No, it said it clearly. Demolish the property or face escalating fines and legal action. My mind spun. How could this be real? Who does that? My dream home, my hard work, was being threatened like some petty crime. I sat on the floor, staring at the email, trying to make sense of it. My hands trembled. My brain raced through all the possibilities. Was there a mistake? Could I fight this? What did they mean by demolish? I felt trapped in a nightmare I hadn't even dreamed. This cabin, my sanctuary, my dream come true, suddenly felt like it was on the edge of being ripped away. And just like that, my peaceful life in the woods became a ticking clock. 48 hours. That was all the time I had. The cabin, my dream, my escape from the world, was suddenly in danger, and I had no idea where to even start. I couldn't believe what I was reading. 48 hours to demolish a cabin that had taken me weeks to restore. It felt like a bad joke, except it wasn't funny. My hands shook as I tried to calm myself. I reread the email again, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the words were the same. The HOA didn't care about history, craftsmanship, or the hours I had spent sanding floors and restoring the fireplace. All they cared about was violations and compliance. And apparently, I was a criminal in their eyes. I tried calling the HOA immediately, hoping to reach a human being who could explain this insanity. Voicemail after voicemail answered, each more generic and automated than the last. "Please leave a message, we will get back to you." I left 3 messages, each one more desperate than the last, my voice trembling, trying to convey that there had to be a mistake. No one called back, not even once. I imagined the president of the HOA laughing as she sipped her coffee, knowing she had me cornered. To make matters worse, the neighbors started noticing. First, it was subtle, curious glances as I carried tools to the cabin, whispers as I walked by. Then the gossip escalated. They started speculating about why the HOA wanted the cabin gone. One neighbor leaned over the fence and said, "Maybe they think it's haunted." I forced a laugh, but inside I was panicking. The cabin wasn't haunted, it was alive with history, and now it seemed like everyone was against me. I spent the next few hours packing, my mind racing. Could I fight this? Did I have any legal rights? The email mentioned irreparable violations, but didn't cite any specific law. It was vague, threatening, and terrifying. My stomach churned as I imagined walking outside the next day and finding bulldozers waiting. 48 hours. That was all the time I had. I felt like a character in a horror movie, except the villain wore khakis and wielded clipboards instead of chainsaws. I decided I needed more information. I started digging through old property records, previous HOA notices, and local building codes. Nothing concrete came up that justified demolition. The cabin was on my property, fully restored and structurally sound. It was historic, untouched for decades, and now apparently a threat to suburban order. I felt a mix of relief and dread. If the HOA didn't have a legal leg to stand on, maybe I could fight them. But fighting them meant confronting them, which terrified me almost as much as losing the cabin. Every knock at the door made my heart jump. Even the mail carrier seemed suspect. The tension in the air was palpable. I started imagining scenarios in my head, HOA board members staking out my driveway, inspectors measuring every inch of the cabin for violations. I even joked to myself, maybe they'll send a squad of lawyers with sledgehammers at midnight. Humor was all I had left to keep from panicking. That night, I barely slept. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the email, and the looming deadline. The hours ticked by slowly, each one heavier than the last. I kept imagining the cabin being torn apart while I sat there helpless, a witness to my own disaster. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This was my dream, my hard work, and some faceless organization thought they could just take it away. I refused to let that happen. The next morning, I woke with a sense of grim determination. I couldn't wait for the HOA to strike. I had to strike first, or at least prepare. I gathered my notebooks, my photos of the cabin before and after restoration, and every email I had ever exchanged with the HOA. I even filmed short clips of the interior, capturing every detail, every corner, every unique feature. If they wanted a fight, I would make sure I had evidence ready. I started imagining strategies. Maybe I could challenge the letter legally, argue historic preservation, or at least buy some time. I called a few friends who knew about property law, hopping for advice. Their reactions varied between disbelief and laughter. One friend said, "Wait, they can't seriously demolish a house in 48 hours, right?" I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew the HOA could be ruthless when they wanted control. By mid-afternoon, the reality settled in. 48 hours, not enough time to destroy the cabin, but maybe just enough time to plan my counterattack. Every step from now on would have to be careful, calculated, and bold. I looked at the cabin and ran my hands over the woodwork, whispering to myself, "You're not going anywhere, not without a fight." The stakes were higher than I had imagined, and the tension in the air was suffocating. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything I had worked for could be gone. And just like that, my peaceful dream had turned into a ticking time bomb. The cabin I loved, the place I had poured my heart into, was now the center of a war I hadn't asked for. 48 hours. That was all the time I had to save it. I couldn't stop thinking about the HOA and their ridiculous demand. Apparently, my historic cabin was a crime against suburban aesthetics. The letter had been vague, full of legal jargon and threats, but the message was clear: demolish it or face consequences, as if I had some choice. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I hadn't even dreamed. The first time I tried to reason with the HOA, I called their office again. Voicemail, then another voicemail. By the third call, I was muttering to myself, imagining their president sitting in a spotless office, clipboard in hand, chuckling at the chaos she was causing. I felt powerless, frustrated, and yes, a little angry. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about control, about someone else deciding what I could and couldn't do on my own property. To make matters worse, the neighbors started noticing. It started small, lingering glances as I carried tools, whispered conversations in front yards, and the occasional knock on my door. Some were curious, others judgmental. One woman even asked if I was planning to attract vermin with that old house. I wanted to laugh, but inside, panic was building. The more people watched, the more I felt the pressure of the clock ticking. 48 hours was not enough to even contemplate destroying the place, let alone defending it. I decided to start documenting everything. Photos, videos, notes, every nail, every brush stroke, every repair. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me, they were in for a surprise. I even filmed a quick walkthrough narrating every detail of the restoration. I pointed out the repaired roof, the polished floors, the functioning fireplace. This cabin wasn't a danger, it was a treasure. And if the HOA wanted a fight, I would give them evidence they couldn't ignore. The more I dug into the situation, the stranger it became. The HOA's claims were vague, citing violations without specifics. They mentioned the cabin didn't match neighborhood aesthetics, but there was no regulation about style. They called it unsafe, but structurally it was sound. My research turned up nothing that gave them the right to demand demolition. The more I realized this, the angrier I got. How dare they threaten to destroy something I had poured my heart into? I started imagining confrontations. The president, armed with her clipboard, standing at the end of my driveway like a villain in a movie. Inspectors measuring windows with rulers, counting nails like detectives searching for evidence. My mind ran wild, exaggerating every detail, but in a way it helped me cope. Humor was my only defense against the rising panic. One afternoon, as I walked through the cabin, I found myself talking out loud. "Don't worry, buddy," I said to the fireplace. "We're not giving up without a fight." It felt ridiculous, but it kept me focused. I also started thinking strategically. I couldn't just wait for the HOA to strike, I had to prepare. I needed allies, a plan, and documentation that would leave them with no argument. The pressure was immense, but I felt a strange sense of purpose. The clock was ticking. Every hour brought new anxiety. I imagined receiving a second email. "Your time is up." 48 hours felt impossibly short. I spent hours packing, making lists, writing down potential strategies. Could I challenge the letter legally? Could I argue historical preservation? Every idea had to be considered. I also had to be careful. One misstep could make the HOA's threats real. As evening fell, the tension in the air was palpable. The sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows, and I imagined the HOA lurking outside, watching my every move. I knew it wasn't realistic, but it mirrored the fear I felt. The cabin, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. Every sound, wind through the trees, a branch snapping, set my heart racing. But amid the fear, a spark of determination grew. I couldn't let the HOA win. This cabin was more than wood and nails. It was my dream, my hard work, and my sanctuary. I realized that surviving the next 48 hours wasn't just about following the law, it was about outsmarting a bureaucracy that thrived on fear. I had to stay sharp, stay clever, and above all, stay calm. That night, I stayed awake, planning, imagining, and rehearsing. I knew the worst was yet to come, but for the first time, I felt ready. The conflict with the HOA wasn't just a battle over a house. It was a test of my resolve, and I was determined not to fail. I knew I couldn't just sit and wait for the HOA to strike. 48 hours wasn't a lot of time, but it was enough to start planning my defense. The problem was, I had no idea where to begin. The cabin was my sanctuary, my dream, and now it had become the center of a war I hadn't asked for. I needed information, allies, and a strategy, and I needed it fast. I started by diving into local laws and historic preservation codes. My laptop became my best friend, and I spent hours reading legal documents, county regulations, and archived HOA notices. It was tedious work, and I had to stop myself from falling asleep at the keyboard more than once, but every detail mattered. Every loophole, every precedent, every line of code could be a weapon if I needed it. Then I remembered my neighbor, Mr. Harris. a retired lawyer with a sharp wit and a sense of humor that sometimes bordered on cruel. I knocked on his door and explained the situation. He raised an eyebrow and laughed, asking if I was serious. When I nodded, he leaned back and said, "Well, I love a good fight. Let's see what we can do." Just having him on my side was a relief. His calm, analytical approach balanced my rising panic and gave me a plan I could actually follow. Together, we started mapping out the battle. We documented every inch of the cabin, took photos of every corner, and even made short video walkthroughs to prove the work I had done. We collected previous correspondence with the HOA, noting vague threats and inconsistencies. Mr. Harris smiled at me and said, "They don't have a leg to stand on if they challenge your work, but we have to play it carefully." His words were reassuring, but the tension never left my chest. While we worked, the neighbors continued to observe. Some whispered, some shook their heads, and a few even offered advice, though most of it was unhelpful. One man suggested I just tear it down and move on, and I nearly laughed out loud. Move on, after all the time and effort I had put in? No chance. Another neighbor offered a more practical tip. Make sure you document everything. They love to twist rules to scare people. I nodded, grateful for at least one useful piece of advice. Every interaction, every step, every glance from the HOA or neighbors felt like a countdown. The 48 hours hung over me like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. I tried to focus on the positives, but it was hard. The cabin, once my peaceful escape, now felt like a fortress under siege. I could feel my pulse racing every time the wind rattled a window or a car drove slowly past the driveway. Every sound became a potential threat. But in the midst of the tension, there were moments of humor that kept me sane. At one point, I joked to Mr. Harris, "Maybe we should hire a team of ninjas to guard the place overnight." He chuckled and said, "As long as they file proper paperwork, I don't see a problem." These little moments reminded me that while the situation was serious, I couldn't let fear paralyze me. The fight was just beginning. As the hours passed, we began drafting letters and gathering evidence. The plan was to challenge the HOA legally, buy as much time as possible, and prove that the cabin was not only safe but historically significant. It wasn't going to be easy. The HOA thrived on intimidation, and they were likely already preparing their next move. Every step had to be precise, calculated, and clever. One mistake could give them the upper hand. By the time night fell, I felt exhausted but determined. The cabin was quiet, the forest surrounding it dark and still, and I took a moment to breathe. I ran my hands over the polished floors and smoothed my fingers along the restored woodwork. "We're not giving up," I whispered, more to myself than to the cabin. The stakes were high and the pressure was immense, but I felt ready to fight. I knew the next day would be critical. It was time to put the plan into motion, to face the HOA head-on, and to show them that I wasn't just some homeowner. They had picked a fight with someone who wasn't backing down. The tension, the uncertainty, and the fear were still there, but so was a new feeling, determination. I had 48 hours, a plan, and the will to protect everything I had built. And so, as the moon rose over the trees and cast shadows across the cabin, I settled in for what would be the longest night of my life. The battle was just beginning, and I had no intention of losing. The next morning, I knew it was time to act. 48 hours felt impossibly short, but I couldn't afford to waste a single second. Armed with my documentation, photos, and video walkthroughs, I approached the cabin with a mix of determination and dread. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the property, and for a moment, I imagined the HOA president lurking in one of them, clipboard in hand, ready to judge my every move. I called Mr. Harris to run through the plan one last time. We would submit a formal response to the HOA, outlining every restoration detail, citing historic preservation laws, and challenging the vague threats in their letter. It was meticulous work, but it had to be done carefully. One misstep and the 48 hours would feel even shorter. His calm voice over the phone helped steady my nerves. "Remember," he said, "they can intimidate you all they want, but facts and law are on our side. Don't let them rattle you." I nodded, taking a deep breath. The fight was officially on. I started by photographing the exterior of the cabin again, noting repairs to the roof, the restored shutters, and the foundation. Then I filmed the interior, narrating each detail: the sanded floors, the repaired fireplace, the old beams that had been reinforced. Every word, every image was meant to prove that the cabin was safe, historically significant, and far from the blight the HOA claimed. As I worked, I felt eyes on me. Neighbors were peeking through their windows, some whispering, some shaking their heads. I tried to ignore them, but the tension was palpable. Every sound, branches cracking underfoot, birds taking flight, a car slowing down nearby, made my pulse spike. I imagined inspectors from the HOA driving down the driveway at any moment, ready to measure every inch with obsessive precision. Humor, my usual defense, was hard to summon in that moment. This was real. After hours of preparation, I finally drafted the letter to the HOA. I laid out every point carefully: documentation of restoration work, evidence of structural soundness, citations from historic preservation laws, and notes about procedural errors in their original letter. Each paragraph was deliberate, each word chosen to show that I was informed, prepared, and ready to defend my property. Sending this letter felt like my first real strike in the battle. Then came the waiting. The hours dragged by. I checked my phone constantly, expecting a reply that never came. The suspense was unbearable. Every knock at the door, every rustle outside made me jump. I imagined the HOA storming in with bulldozers, demanding compliance. The cabin, my sanctuary, was suddenly the setting for a thriller, and I was both hero and hostage. In the late afternoon, I received a call from a neighbor. She said she had overheard a conversation at the HOA office, something about making an example of my cabin. My stomach dropped. Apparently, the HOA wasn't backing down, they were escalating. The fight was no longer just about my property, it was about power, control, and sending a message to the entire neighborhood. The stakes had just doubled. But I refused to panic. Mr. Harris reminded me that we were prepared, that evidence and law were on our side. We went over the plan again, anticipating potential counterattacks. We discussed what to do if inspectors showed up unannounced, if neighbors were pressured to testify against me, or if the HOA tried to ignore our letter entirely. Every scenario was imagined, every move calculated. I felt a strange mix of fear and empowerment. This wasn't just survival, it was strategy. As night fell, the tension only grew. The cabin, once a peaceful retreat, now felt like a fortress under siege. I paced the floors, running my hands over the polished wood, whispering to myself, "We're not giving up." The moonlight cast long shadows across the walls, making the space feel simultaneously safe and threatening. The battle lines were drawn. The clock was ticking. The HOA was out there, and I had no choice but to face them head-on. And so, with documentation in hand and determination in my heart, I settled in for what would be a long night. The 48-hour countdown was still in motion, and the first confrontation with the HOA was looming. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to let them win without a fight. The next morning, I felt like I was walking a tightrope. The 48-hour countdown was merciless, and every second felt like a reminder that the HOA could strike at any moment. But then, as I sifted through old property records and county archives one last time, I stumbled across something I hadn't noticed before. A small notation in the historic registry database. My cabin was officially listed as a protected historic structure. I reread the entry over and over, hardly daring to believe it. This tiny, seemingly insignificant detail could change everything. The HOA had threatened demolition, but now it appeared they didn't have the legal authority to force my hand. Suddenly, the dread that had been pressing down on me lifted slightly, replaced with cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, I had a chance. I called Mr. Harris immediately, my voice trembling with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," I said. He listened as I explained, and for the first time in days, I heard a chuckle on the other end of the line. "Well," he said, "it seems like they picked the wrong fight." His calm reassurance grounded me. For the first time, I felt like I had leverage. But the relief was tempered by caution. The HOA didn't respond well to surprises, and they were still a formidable opponent. They thrived on intimidation, on creating a sense of panic. I imagined the president, clipboard in hand, realizing she couldn't bulldoze my cabin without consequences. The thought made me smirk, but I also knew she would escalate if she could. I had to be prepared for anything. I spent the rest of the day preparing for potential confrontations. I printed out the historic registry documents, gathered my previous photos and videos, and organized every piece of evidence into a clear, concise presentation. The plan was simple. If the HOA attempted any enforcement, I could prove legally and irrefutably that they had no authority to demand demolition. Every document, every record, every photo became a shield. Neighbors continued to watch, their curiosity growing by the hour. Some offered advice, some just gawked. One man whispered, "I can't believe they'd try to destroy something like that." I nodded silently, feeling both frustration and amusement. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me, but the stakes were too high for humor alone. I needed focus, strategy, and patience. As evening approached, the tension grew unbearable. The forest around the cabin was dark, the wind rattling the windows, making every shadow seem like a threat. I checked my phone constantly, half. The day of the final meeting arrived, and my nerves were stretched tighter than a bowstring. Every step toward the HOA office felt heavier than the last, as if the cabin itself were urging me to fight. 48 hours had already passed in a blur of research, documentation, and tense preparation, and now it all came down to this. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment that would decide the fate of everything I had worked for. I walked in and immediately sensed the tension in the room. The HOA board members were gathered around a long, polished table, their clipboards and pens ready, their eyes fixed on me like hawks. The president, clipboard in hand, gave me a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that facts, law, and preparation were my weapons. They might try to intimidate me, but I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The meeting began with the usual barrage of complaints. They cited vague violations, referenced neighborhood rules, and suggested the cabin diminished the aesthetic value of the community. My stomach churned as I listened, but I stayed calm, speaking only when necessary, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. I presented the evidence I had spent days compiling: photographs, videos, restoration logs, and references to historic preservation codes. Every point I made chipped away at their authority, brick by brick. As the discussion grew heated, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. The president tried to interrupt me multiple times, her voice sharp and insistent, but I calmly held my ground. Every member of the board seemed visibly frustrated, scribbling notes and whispering among themselves. I realized they weren't used to being challenged, and the confidence I projected seemed to rattle them. Humor crept into my mind despite the stress. I imagined them packing like characters in a bad sitcom, each line of argument more absurd than the last. It kept me steady. Midway through the meeting, the president made a move that could have ended it all. She suggested sending inspectors to the cabin immediately to enforce demolition orders. My heart skipped a beat. This was the moment I had feared. If they sent people now, I might not have enough time to respond, and the cabin could be at risk. I took a deep breath, reminded myself of my preparation, and calmly responded, citing the historic protections and procedural errors in their original notice. My words landed like carefully placed arrows, piercing their bluff and slowing their momentum. The room fell into tense silence. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. Every second felt like an hour. I watched the president's face tighten, her confidence faltering. For a moment it was almost comical, like watching someone realize their script had been stolen mid-performance. I didn't smile out loud, but inside I felt a surge of vindication. This was working. My preparation, my determination, and my calm demeanor were holding the line. Then came the critical moment. The board began debating among themselves, the president's authority clearly weakened. Whispers filled the room, and I could sense that my evidence had shifted the balance. My cabin, the place I had poured my heart into, was no longer just a target. It had become untouchable under the law and under careful scrutiny. I remained composed, letting the tension build, knowing that patience was my greatest weapon. Finally, the president spoke again, her voice quieter, almost reluctant. She suggested a compromise, one that would allow the cabin to remain, but with certain restrictions. Restrictions that, frankly, I could live with. It was a victory, though hard-won and tinged with exhaustion. The room's tension lifted slightly, replaced by the awkward relief of people who realized they had underestimated their opponent. I left the meeting with a strange mix of exhaustion, triumph, and lingering anxiety. The cabin was safe, but the battle had taken its toll. I knew the HOA might try to regroup, might look for other ways to assert control, but for now I had won. I had stood my ground, fought with preparation and calm determination, and preserved something far more than wood and nails. It was my dream, my sanctuary, my hard work. As I drove back to the cabin, the tension slowly ebbed, replaced by a cautious sense of victory. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the forest and illuminating the cabin in a way that made it feel even more alive. I pulled into the driveway, ran my hands over the restored wood, and whispered, "We did it! Not a step closer to losing you." The cabin had survived the storm, and so had I, but the memory of those 48 hours would linger, a reminder of how quickly peace can be threatened, and how fiercely it can be defended. After leaving the HOA meeting, I drove back to the cabin with a mix of relief and disbelief. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long, golden streaks across the property, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. The cabin had survived. My dream home, my sanctuary, the place I had poured countless hours into restoring, was still mine. But even as relief washed over me, a part of me remained tense, aware that the HOA could try to find another way to interfere. The battle wasn't just over paperwork. It was about proving that I wouldn't be bullied. When I arrived, I paused at the edge of the driveway and just looked at the cabin. It felt alive, almost as if it had sensed the fight on my behalf. The wood gleamed under the fading sunlight, the windows reflected the fiery sky, and the forest around it seemed to hum with quiet approval. I ran my hands along the polished floors and the restored beams, each touch a reminder of what I had saved. The weight of those 48 hours pressed down on me, but so did the pride of knowing I had stood my ground. The neighbors were out, curious as ever. Some whispered, some waved, some even clapped quietly. I smiled at them, a mix of exhaustion and triumph on my face. It was strange to realize that my little cabin had become a symbol, not just of historic preservation, but of persistence and courage. The HOA had tried to intimidate me, to make me feel powerless, but instead, I had taken control. The fear that had shadowed every step for 2 days had transformed into determination. I took a deep breath and went inside. The cabin felt warmer, more alive than ever. I sat in the living room, staring at the fireplace I had restored, imagining all the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings that awaited me. Every nail, every brushstroke, every moment of labor had been worth it. It wasn't just about saving a building. It was about preserving a dream, a memory, a piece of history. And I had done it. As the night fell, I realized how much I had learned from this ordeal. I had learned that preparation mattered, that knowledge was power, and that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. I thought about the tension, the adrenaline, the constant fear of losing everything, and I smiled wryly. Without those intense 48 hours, I might never have truly understood the value of persistence or the strength I had within me. I also reflected on the humor that had carried me through. Imagining the HOA president with laser eyes, picturing inspectors measuring nails like detectives, even joking about ninjas guarding the cabin. Those little mental escapes had kept me sane. Laughter, even in the darkest moments, had reminded me not to be paralyzed by fear. It was a strange, wonderful mix of stress and comedy that somehow made the fight bearable. Over the next few days, life slowly returned to normal. The HOA sent a few letters acknowledging my compliance with their procedural requirements, but the threat of demolition had vanished. I continued working on small improvements, now with a sense of security and renewed purpose. I even hung a small, humorous sign on the porch, "HOA not allowed beyond this point," just to mark the victory in a light-hearted way. It was silly, but it felt good to claim that space for myself. Sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun set through the trees, I realized the cabin had become more than a home. It was proof of resilience, of standing up for what you love, and of fighting for the things that matter. The forest around it, the creak of the floors, the smell of aged wood, they all reminded me that some dreams are worth defending, no matter how impossible it seems. And yet I knew this was just one battle. The neighborhood, the HOA, the challenges of maintaining a historic property, they were all still out there. But now I felt prepared. I had learned to face intimidation with evidence, humor, and persistence. I had discovered that even in the most stressful, high-stakes situations, it was possible to win if you stayed calm, stayed informed, and never gave up. As darkness settled over the forest and the cabin glowed softly in the moonlight, I took one last deep breath, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. The cabin was safe. My dream had survived, and I knew no matter what came next, I had the strength to face it. The 48-hour countdown had ended, but the story of the cabin and my determination would continue for a long time. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.